Arratsaldeon, ongi etorri guztioi, bereziki gaurko hitzlariari Mel Ainscow jaunari. Good evening, profesor Ainscow. Bienvenido y muchas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros. Este curso 2011-2012 celebramos el 125 aniversario de la Universidad de Deusto, que inició su andadura allá por 1886 bajo la denominación de Colegio de Estudios Superiores. Los actos académicos de esta celebración giran en torno al lema 25 años de cambios profundos en un mundo global. 25 años ya desde el centenario de la Universidad, que pretendemos revisar necesariamente de forma muy fragmentaria, desde la perspectiva propia de cada una de las 6 facultades que conforman la Universidad de Deusto. Con este fin, DeustoForum abre sus puertas y se alegra y honra de que tomen su espacio las facultades. En este momento, o en este marco, la Facultad de Psicología y Educación ha centrado sus actos conmemorativos, o mejor, sus actos de celebración, porque creo que hay motivos para celebrar, en torno a una idea central: calidad de vida, inclusión social y procesos de intervención. Idea con la que enlaza los actos que habéis realizado a lo largo del día de hoy y, en concreto, esta conferencia que corresponde presentar al decano de la facultad, don Josu Solabarrieta, a quien cedo sin más la palabra.
Beno, ongi etorria denok, Psikologia eta Hezkuntza Fakultateak Deustuko Universidadaren 125. urte horren honetan, ospakizun honen barne antolatu duen foro honetara. Jakingo duzuen bezala, ekitaldi honetako gaiak, bizitza kalitatea, gizarte inklusioa eta esku hartze prozesuak dira. Eta azpimarratu nahiko nuke, erronka hauek gure fakultatearen misioan eta Deustuko Universidadaren proiektuan nabarmen ageri direla. Gure fakultateko hezkuntza eta ikerkuntza jarduerak bizitza kalitatea, inklusioa eta justizia soziala suspertzea bideratuta daude hain zuzen ere. Eta horrek ematen dio azken finean benetako zentzua gure graduei, gure graduondoei, doktorego programei, etengabeko prestakuntza, ikerkuntza, esku hartze eta ekitaldi guztiei. Eta gaurko hizlariak hain zuzen ere izugarrizko eragina izan du arlo hauetan, bai gure inguruan eta baita nazioartean ere. Bienvenidos todos y todas. La Facultad de Psicología y Educación, en el marco de la celebración del 125 aniversario de la Universidad de Deusto, organiza este tercer foro sobre la calidad de vida y la inclusión social de las personas, tomando esto como objetivo de diversos procesos de intervención profesional, psicológica, educativa, en campos como la salud, la educación y los servicios sociales. Los equipos de investigación de la facultad, y particularmente el último que hemos configurado específicamente para este ámbito de intervención, comparten la misión de ser agentes de promoción del cambio social que, a través de la generación del conocimiento científico, buscan lograr mayores cotas de bienestar y de calidad de vida en todas las personas, con el fin de lograr una sociedad más inclusiva, participativa, justa y democrática. Esta misión que hemos asumido está enraizada en una tradición compartida de la psicología y de la educación que busca un equilibrio entre el desarrollo del conocimiento científico, la investigación y la intervención en la sociedad, la acción. Los principios de la Universidad de Deusto enmarcan dicha misión. Concretamente hoy, la Facultad de Psicología y Educación organiza 2 jornadas en este foro. Mañana será la segunda. Por la mañana hemos tenido un seminario académico dirigido por el profesor Ainscow y una sesión de presentaciones del alumnado acerca de la calidad de vida y de la inclusión social. Y esta tarde, anteriormente, hemos tenido una mesa redonda sobre la inclusión educativa aquí y ahora. Ahora cerraremos la jornada con una conferencia del profesor Mel Ainscow sobre las estrategias para promover la equidad dentro de los sistemas educativos. El profesor Mel Ainscow no es una referencia más en el mundo académico, sino que podemos decir que tal vez sea el referente mundial más importante en lo referente a educación inclusiva. Concretamente, su impacto en la comunidad autónoma vasca ha sido, y es, y será enorme. Por citar, concretamente el Departamento de Educación tradujo una obra suya de carácter práctico destinada a profesores y escuelas que ha tenido una gran repercusión también internacional. Y me refiero con ello a su Index for Inclusion, que escribió y que publicó junto a Tony Booth. En su trabajo, el profesor Ainscow ha tratado siempre de explorar las conexiones entre la inclusión educativa, la formación del profesorado y la mejora de la calidad de las escuelas. Sus ideas y sus propuestas son en la actualidad fuente de inspiración constante para profesionales y administradores vinculados con la educación inclusiva en los países en los cuales esta educación inclusiva tiene un importante desarrollo, entre los cuales, afortunadamente, está el nuestro. Tiene un currículum muy denso, muy amplio, que no voy a repasar, pero sí me gustaría destacar que fue director de un proyecto de la UNESCO sobre la formación del profesorado en educación inclusiva, un proyecto que implicó una potente investigación y implicó también la puesta en práctica de los resultados de esta investigación en más de 80 países, y también destacar que fue consultor que es consultor de UNESCO, de UNICEF y de Save the Children. También hay que mencionar, pues yo creo que es importante tenerlo en cuenta, que fue anteriormente director de colegio, responsable municipal de educación, inspector educativo y profesor en la Universidad de Cambridge. Y de destacar algo de su manera de investigar y de su manera de trabajar, habría que destacar cómo en sus investigaciones utiliza metodologías participativas para exponer sistemáticamente el impacto directo de lo que pensamos y de lo que hacemos en educación, en las aulas, en las escuelas y en los sistemas educativos. Y sin más, Professor Ainscow, welcome. Thank you for accepting our invitation. And,
thank you very much indeed. Well, thank you and good evening. When I hear a very wonderful introduction like that, and I'm told and reminded of the different jobs I've done in the different places, I start to feel very old. So I wanted to tell you, I didn't stay in any of those places very long. I've got to the stage now where I don't just lie about my own age and my children's age, I also lie about my grandchildren's age. So that's the way things go. When I arrived here last night, I was told that it was part of this great celebration of this beautiful university. I'm so impressed with the resources and the atmosphere in the university. And somebody said to me over a very nice dinner last night, it's going to be like a giant birthday party, and you're the birthday cake. You know? And I had this vision of 125 candles on my head, you know. Anyway, it is delightful to be here and to share some ideas with you, which I hope are relevant to all of your work, whether you are working in schools or in the university. Many of you I know are students on the way into working into the education system. At Manchester, I'm part of a group of researchers whose interest is in this idea of equity. And I think I need to start by explaining what's in my mind when I say equity. I take equity to be about inclusion, including every child, every young person into the school. But I also want to go beyond inclusion and talk about fairness, because we could include somebody and not treat them fairly. So the vision I have and what's informing my work and my colleagues is how do we develop schools and then school systems which are equitable, inclusive and fair. Inevitably, a lot of my work is with individual schools and with networks of schools, but what I've gone on to be really preoccupied with in the last few years is how do we take whole systems forward, whether that's systems at the local level, in Bilbao or in the Basque region, or at the national level. But it seems to me that we will only make so much progress if we just concentrate on individual schools. That if we can actually coordinate our efforts within individual schools in relation to other schools and the whole system, then maybe we can make more progress. So I'm going to talk about developments in my own country. And in saying that, I need to give you a health warning. I need to give you a health warning. Education, and schools in particular, are very much tied in with local history and local culture. And although schools look very similar wherever you go in the world, as soon as you start to look more closely, And as soon as you start to talk to teachers, to children, to parents, you realize that systems work very differently. So therefore, it's dangerous to think you can take ideas from one place, put them on an aeroplane, and take them to another place. And so I'm very concerned to say to you, what I'm talking about are experiences in England from which I will try to draw some lessons, but these, to mix my metaphor, these are not a recipe. They're not a recipe. You can't just say, this worked in England, therefore we'll use it in Spain. To stay with the metaphor of food, maybe they suggest some ingredients, but the ingredients will need to be mixed in different ways to suit the particular circumstances in that respect. So I'm talking about England, I'm drawing lessons, but I leave it for you to think about whether the sorts of things I'm talking about connect to the local experience in the Basque Country and whether they are feasible in terms of where you're at the moment in that respect. Let me say a little bit then about England. And I'm talking about England because remember the United Kingdom consists of 4 separate entities: England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. Each has a separate education system. Don't ask me why, but that is part of our history. So we have separate education systems, and I'm talking only about England, which of course is the most numerous of those 4 countries in that respect. Over 20 years, just over, successive governments have really seriously tried to improve state education. And we've had governments of very different persuasions, very different parties, but the one thing that's been common in those 20 years or more is that every one of the government has made education one of its priorities. And you may remember when Tony Blair was elected in 1997, he actually said, I've only got 3 priorities. And his 3 priorities were education, education, and education. All right? So whatever we say about politicians, I would have to say that in my country, although I have views politically, I have to be fair and say every one of our governments have made education a priority, and they've pumped a lot of resources in, they've passed a lot of legislation, and they've made lots of efforts to move the system forward. Now, the question of the impact of all of that is a matter of debate in my country, amongst teachers, amongst the community, and of course amongst researchers. There are disputes, but I think there is a consensus that the education system, the state education system, is a lot better than it was before. That it's better managed, it has better prepared teachers, and it has teachers who work a lot harder than teachers used to do. And I say that with some personal knowledge. My son is a primary school teacher, and my daughter is a secondary school teacher. And believe me, they work a lot harder than I ever did as a teacher, including spending a lot of time at the weekend preparing their lessons and so on. So we see this massive push to improve the education system. Much of that has been associated with increasing centralization. The introduction way back in 1988 of a centralized national curriculum. What followed was the introduction of national testing systems. We boast that our English children are probably the most tested children in the world, right? So we have testing and examinations. A national inspection system so that schools are regularly inspected, and the reports from those inspections are published regularly in the newspaper and in the media, all based on the assumption held by different political parties that the way to improve standards is to increase competition in the system and to give parents more choice. Right? Increasing competition, parents having choice, and in order to enable them to have choice, they have to have information. They have to know how well the school is performing, hence the need for testing. I say all of that because I feel fairly confident that here in Spain you're going to see more of the same in the near future, because Spanish politicians are very aware that on the international comparisons that politicians are very preoccupied with these days, Spain does relatively poorly. And so they will look to other countries and they will adopt similar patterns. So I warn you that that is coming. Increasing centralisation, competition and choice. And I say again, it has raised standards. It has raised, in a sense, the minimum standards across the system. Now, my interest, of course, is not just in raising standards, well, I'm all for that. My interest is in making sure that in raising standards, we don't leave some children behind. The most vulnerable children, whoever they might be. That is the equity agenda, making sure that everybody is being reached in terms of our efforts to improve the system in that respect. And with my colleagues in the University of Manchester, we have worked over the last 15 years or so in the system, as the Dean has said, working collaboratively with schools and communities to try to make sense of what's been happening in the system and to see if we can contribute to the strengthening the system around the theme of equity. And then there are some very big issues and some big problems that have to be addressed. The issues are captured in this photograph. It was taken in 1936. 1936. You could take the photograph today and it would not look very different. The boys on the right-hand side go to one of our most famous private schools. They are children of the wealthiest families in my country. They could include members of the royal family. They certainly include boys who eventually may well come to be the Prime Minister or other members of the government. They are wearing the traditional costume of the school, the uniform, which is still the same today. But more importantly, they are wearing on their faces and in their body language an expression of how they feel about themselves. They know that their families are preparing them to be successful, to be wealthy, to be people who will take on senior positions in industry, in banks, in whatever field of work they're doing. Look at their faces, look at their posture. These young men are full of confidence. The boys on the left-hand side of the photograph are the local boys from the local area where the school is. If we took the photograph today, they would have different clothes on. They would have jeans and T-shirts and baseball caps. But I would suggest to you that the pictures of their faces would look very similar. They would be looking at these other boys and they would be thinking, what planet do you come from? What world do you live in? Because you don't live in our world. What we're seeing are the expressions through the education system of a divided society where the wealthy look after themselves and their children and where the poorest community are much less able to do that. Even when government says you have choice, many of them do not have the capacity to make the choices. Now, the photograph is of extremes, the wealthiest and some of the poorest. But within the state system in my country, we then have schools at different levels. Schools that serve relatively wealthy areas of the country, schools that serve the middle classes, and schools that serve the very poorest communities. So what I'm saying to you is, any school system reflects the nature of its society. And this school system reflects one of the most unequal societies in the world. And the system prepares people for their place in the next generation. At the top of the slide is a quote related to an OECD study of the wealthiest countries of the world. And they conclude that the United Kingdom has the most extreme of wealth and poverty, and that the best predictor of educational progress as far as English children is concerned is their home background. The implication of that is that the evidence we have suggests that the most vulnerable children in my society are children from extremely poor homes. There are other vulnerable groups, of course. Children from certain immigrant backgrounds, children who are in public care, children with disabilities, and of course some of those are the same children. But the most vulnerable children are children of the poor. And interestingly, when we look at the statistics, children of the white poor, children of white families, often living together on estates, public housing estates. We've called them the working classes, but unfortunately in my country, many of them are the non-working classes because they don't have jobs, and in many cases have not had jobs for 2 or even 3 generations. So the children are brought up in families where going to work is not part of the culture of the family in that respect, really. So I'm wanting to explore how do we develop an education system that breaks that pattern, that makes the most vulnerable less vulnerable. You might say to me, that's impossible. The rich are always going to be rich, and the poor will always be with us, as it says in the Bible. But there are countries of the world which do extremely well on all the quality indicators, but do extremely well for the vast majority of their children. According to the evidence we have, the 3 countries that do most well in that respect are Finland, Canada, and South Korea. What is common about those countries, it's difficult to see. But those 3 countries are at the top of the league in terms of excellence, but also are at the top of the league in terms of equity. They are very inclusive school systems. So it says to us, you in Spain, me in England, because your system is not that much different to mine, it is possible to do something about this. We ought to be doing a better job than we are doing. So that is my interest. Over the years that we've worked with the English education system, we try to analyse the impact of the efforts of these successive governments. And we see certain patterns in the evidence that we have collected, which seems to us to be quite important in terms of thinking what needs to happen, certainly in England, and possibly in other countries, like Spain, some of the other European countries, certainly the United States, which also does very badly in relation to equity, right? So this is not about overall national wealth. There is the richest country in the world, the United States, and they do very poorly in terms of equity, right? So what I'm looking at through this analysis is what can we learn from the English education system that points to the actions that need to be taken? Well, the steps create the sense of the ingredients that I think need to be considered. Our analysis suggests that the system in England still has more capacity to improve itself than is actually being used. And what I often say when I'm talking to head teachers in England, I always say to them, your school has more expertise than it's actually using. There's more expertise there in your school than you are using at the moment. And if you want to improve your school, which I'm sure you do, you have to make better use of the expertise that's there. So the implication of that is improving a school, especially in relation to this idea of equity, inclusion and fairness, is about looking inwards, making better use of the experiences, the expertise, and the creativity that's within the school. Not looking elsewhere for ideas, but first of all, making sure you're using the resources, the human resources that's there within your school. Now, the problem of the English reforms over the last few years is that it's not been based upon that rationale. It's not been based upon making use of what's there. It's based on centralized strategies to bring ideas from elsewhere. Now, the impact of those centralized strategies, as I've already said, has had a positive effect in terms of raising the minimum standards. The downside, from our observations, is that it has deadened the system. It's taken out the creativity. Teachers have become like robots, teaching to the test, following formulas which are dictated from the government, being preoccupied with what the inspectors will be looking for when they come on the regular inspection process. So as I say, it's raised the minimum standards, but the price we've paid is we've lost the innovation and the creativity. And that connects to our agenda this evening, colleagues, because if we are not reaching some of the children, and we're not, there's no point in doing more of the same. If we do more of the same, we'll get more of the same. So what we need in the system is innovation. We need to free space so that teachers in particular feel that they can experiment in looking for new ways of reaching the children we're not reaching and including the children who feel marginalised. So our recommendation, based on all of that, points to certain things that need to go on to stimulate creativity. First of all, it points to the need for greater collaboration within the system. What we know about organisations of any kind, in business, in society, in universities, and in schools, is that if people are left on their own, they run out of resources in terms of what they might try. If people come together in teams, in groups, in networks, then of course they learn from one another and they challenge one another and they stimulate one another. And what I've learned is the schools that are most effective and therefore most inclusive are schools that are characterised by collaboration and teamwork. Teachers working together, children working together, learning from each other, schools working with parents and the wider community. A process of collaboration which stimulates innovation. And what we've also learned, certainly in my country over the last few years, is that can be extended beyond the school gate, not just to the families and the community, but also to other schools. You can create networks of schools where schools learn from one another, a concept that I'll come back to in a few minutes' time. But collaboration of itself, even though it is essential, is not sufficient. What we know is that you can collaborate with people to stay the same. You can collude with other people to say, there's no more we can do. There's nothing else we can do. There's nothing we can do with these children. They're too difficult. There's nothing we can do with these resources. We haven't got enough resources. There's nothing we can do with this government policy, which is a barrier. So you can collude with one another to stay the same. So effective collaboration within a school and beyond a school has to have some other ingredient. And the ingredient I'm suggesting from our work is the ingredient is that of evidence. You have to have evidence that brings a critical edge to the collaboration so that it matures and so that people are challenged to think in new ways. Evidence can take many different forms. The obvious evidence that we have in schools are statistics. Statistics, we count everything in school. Who's here, who's missing, who's late, who's getting into trouble, who's doing well in the tests. We can dig into those statistics and they challenge the collaboration to ask questions about why. But of course, those of you who know about research methods, and I'm sure most people in the room do, will know that every research method has its limitations. And the limitations of statistics are that whilst they show you the pattern, they indicate what things look like, they don't tell you why they're like that. And if we want to intervene, which is what this conference is about, we have to understand why things are as they are in order to decide what we might do next. So we need other kinds of information, therefore other kinds of inquiry of a qualitative kind. We need to find out what's it like in the school. So we need observation, we need discussion. And when I look at schools that make progress in using the expertise that's there to reach out more effectively to all of the children, built into the school always are opportunities for teachers to see one another working so they can share ideas, and opportunities for children to tell us what it's like to be a learner. The voice of the children creates a critical edge in that respect, really. And so those of you who are working in schools, what I would say to you is, if your colleagues do not have chance to see one another teaching and talk about their shared experience, if you do not have effective strategies for listening to the voice of children, then you have a very limited view of what it's like to be a learner in your school. So that's the form that I'm suggesting we need to create in a school to get it moving in a more inclusive direction. Let me summarize. Making use of the expertise that's there, encouraging innovation through collaboration, and using evidence to challenge one another's assumptions in order that we can think about new possibilities. But then there's another factor that we need to build into the equation if we are to really make progress. And it relates to the connection between schools and the external world and the communities that they serve. If we look at some of the major projects, particularly in North America, to bring about improvement in education systems, particularly in the urban contexts, Chicago, Los Angeles, the big cities and the big conurbations, what the pattern is clear, that those efforts to improve the system do not work unless they include efforts to change the experience of children in the family and in the community. We have to link the improvement of the school to the improvement of social conditions. We have to look at housing, we have to look at transport, we have to look at career opportunities in order that we create pathways for the most vulnerable groups within the school in that respect. So I'm adding an extra responsibility to the school. It's not just doing a good job in the classrooms, it's connecting that to developments in the wider community. All those ingredients lead to one place, the final point in my list of ingredients, and that is none of this will happen by chance. It has to be led. But we need a particular kind of leadership, a leadership which is participatory, a leadership which gives space for many people to take a lead, not just the senior people who are paid to manage, but everybody else in the system. And of course, the most crucial leaders, as far as education is concerned, certainly as far as the children are concerned, is the teacher in the classroom. When the children go into the classroom and the door is closed, it doesn't really matter what the Minister of Education says. It doesn't really matter what the local politicians say. It doesn't really matter what the school director says. For the next hour, the teacher is the policy. What she does, what she chooses to do, makes the difference or not. That's why bringing about change in education system is so difficult. Politicians find this impossible to understand. They pass the legislation. They produce the resources. They provide the lead. Nothing changes. Education systems, and schools in particular, are very resistant to change. Not because teachers are lazy, not because teachers don't want to do a good job, simply because teachers are extremely busy, surrounded by very challenging children who want their time and want their energy in that respect. So bringing about change in an education system requires a very smart strategy, one which will operate at every level, most importantly at the classroom level. In 2007, somewhat to my surprise, I was called to see one of the ministers of education in London, and I was told that there was to be a major project to improve education in Greater Manchester, and I was asked if I would be prepared to lead that project. And the government were prepared to pay the university to release me for a period of approximately 4 years to work on that project. And of course, given everything I've told you, what a fantastic chance to actually have resources and have government support to try all this out in a particular system. The project was called the Greater Manchester Challenge. It began in March 2007 and concluded in March of this year. And it was an attempt to do what I've said: improve overall standards and close the gap between the most vulnerable children and those children who are doing very well, set in the context of this very divided system. The decision to put the project in Greater Manchester was because the evidence that was available suggested that the system was doing extremely badly. So this was not the reward for doing a wonderful job, quite the opposite. It was a very strongly implied criticism that things are simply not working. Let me say a little bit then about Greater Manchester. And you notice I'm talking about Greater Manchester, a much wider area than the city itself. Greater Manchester consists of 10 local authorities, one of which is the City of Manchester. But each of the local authorities traditionally has operated as a separate system. It serves a conurbation of about 2.5 million people, which generates about 600,000 children and young people in the primary and the secondary schools. It's an incredibly diverse region, with, of course, some very, very wealthy people, some of whom play for Manchester United and earn millions and millions of pounds. But, of course, it is also a concentration of incredibly poor and disadvantaged families, many of whom are concentrated in these public housing estates that I've talked to. It's rich and diverse in another way. Across the region, something like 150 languages are spoken amongst the families. We have families who've come relatively recently from every corner of the world. Approximately 16% of children do not speak English in their family. They speak another language in that respect. So incredible diversity, but very poor performance overall. There had previously been another project in London called the London Challenge, which started in 2002 and continued to 2007. And it had been incredibly successful, and that was why ministers had decided to have another try. What we knew about the London Challenge was that in this very centralised policy context, ministers had given London permission to experiment, to innovate. In other words, to do exactly what I am recommending in that respect. The London Challenge had only worked in the secondary schools. In 2007, when the ministers decided to extend this programme, they gave London another 3 years, and they extended it into the primary schools. And in Greater Manchester, we were to work in primary and secondary and linked to the various forms of special provision. There are approximately 1,150 schools in Greater Manchester. The budget for the project was £50 million. So quite a lot of money, but when you think about 1,150 schools and you spread it around, it isn't that much money in terms of public spending on education. But £50 million gives you the potential of leverage, things that can give incentives to make things happen. I brought to the discussion all that earlier research that I've talked to you about, but I also spent an enormous amount of time in London trying to capture what had been learnt through the London Challenge experience. And I picked up all sorts of good ideas, of course. But the central idea, and which is really central to everything I'm suggesting that you think about here in the Basque region, the central idea that I got from London was you have to analyse the context in order to determine where the biggest issues are that need to be addressed. And you also have to analyse the context to find the strengths, in other words, the resources that can be used to address the issues, and especially the human resources. Now that fits with everything I've said, that when you want to move something forward, whether it's a classroom or a school district or a country, you have to carry out a situational analysis. You cannot presume that an idea from another place will never necessarily fit your place. So that's effectively what we did. Over the earlier period of this Greater Manchester Challenge, we spent a lot of time analysing the statistics, but we also spent a lot of time talking to people in the system, teachers, administrators, parents, children, to get a feel of what the system was about. It took quite a long time, and of course we didn't have a lot of time, because what comes with the money, what comes with a lot of money, is pressure. And the nature of the pressure, as far as ministers were concerned, is we want to see rapid improvements. Don't tell us it's too complicated. Don't tell us it's going to take decades, because in 3 years' time we will have an election and we want to show that we've made a difference. All right? So coming with the money is pressure. There's no question about it. But you can use that in some ways to focus people's minds in that respect, really. So the analysis had to be done initially, very quickly, but then we continued with the process. Through that analysis, we developed an overall strategy. It was not there at the beginning. It's not the same as the London strategy, but by the middle of the second year of this 3-year project, it looked like this. The strategy is one of creating pathways in order that we can move best practice and expertise and knowledge around the system. So it's a process of finding ways of moving knowledge around. And that was the mantra that I used a lot within the project. What we're going to do is we're going to move knowledge around. What we know is the expertise that we need is here in Greater Manchester. We don't need people from outside to come and tell us what to do. We have the expertise in our schools and in our community. Now you can start anywhere you want on the diagram because all these things interconnect. But I'll start on the left-hand side with what we call our Keys to Success program. These were the schools that were in the most challenging circumstances. We called them the Keys to Success schools. And the implication of that title is that if we can bring rapid improvements to these schools, that will have an impact across the whole system, that it will create a kind of ripple effect. If these schools serving the most poor communities make rapid improvement, the challenge that it means to everybody else is, what are you doing? Why can't you do better in that respect? Over the 3 years, we designated something like 160 schools as keys to success, primary, secondary, and some special provision as well. You can imagine that at the beginning, people were not enthusiastic about joining a club of schools that all seemed to be doing badly. not the kind of club that you want to be a member of. As the thing evolved, the title Keys to Success came to be seen as a badge of honour. Schools were proud to be keys to success because, put simply, almost all of these schools made fantastic progress very quickly. And it was reflected in improvements in attendance, improvements in behaviour, and, of course, what the ministers were looking for, improvements in test scores. They made very rapid progress. Now, the question, of course, obviously is, how? What did you do? We had a team of expert advisors, all of whom had been very successful school directors in challenging circumstances, who worked with these schools to analyse their context, to find their strengths, and to build on those strengths to move the school forward. We talked about getting behind the people in these schools. We were trying to move from a discourse which said these are failing schools, these are schools that are dysfunctional, serving dysfunctional communities, and we were trying to create a sense of positive image within those schools. So every school had its own plan, fitted to its own context. And that was important. But gradually, a pattern emerged. A pattern which I think has enormous potential as we think about moving school systems in a more equitable direction. The pattern was this. In almost every case, those 160 schools each had a partner school. And the partner school was chosen because it has strengths in the areas where the keys to success needed help. In all cases, the partnership was with schools from another local authority. So we were not partnering schools with neighbours, local schools where there is competition and maybe tension. We were partnering schools that were from different areas of Greater Manchester in that respect. So we were crossing boundaries. We were crossing the boundaries of the 10 local authorities. But we were going more than that. We were crossing other kind of boundaries. So, for example, there was one particular primary school that we found in a very poor area, in a town called Wigan, which was brilliant at teaching children how to read. One of my colleagues partnered it with a secondary school in another of the local authorities, Salford, where it was clear that low levels of literacy were preventing children from making progress across the curriculum. And the teachers from the primary school worked with their colleagues in the secondary school in strengthening the teaching of literacy. So we were crossing the boundary of age, the primary and the secondary. We found from our analysis that in Greater Manchester, we had some fantastically effective special schools, working with children, different types of disability. Those very strong special schools were partnered with mainstream primary or secondary school to help with things to do with learning difficulties, behaviour difficulties, with the training of support staff and so on. And we were opening doors where there was a boundary, a barrier that was preventing that collaboration. We had other kind of boundaries we crossed. There was a school in the city of Manchester, a big primary school, that serves an area where almost all the families are originally from Pakistan. So all the families are of the Muslim faith, a big school. One of my colleagues partnered it with another very big primary school in another part of Greater Manchester, Bury, for those who know the area, that was a school, a state school for children from the Jewish Orthodox religion. So we had a Jewish Orthodox school supporting a school that was predominantly Muslim. The impact of the partnership was fantastic. Not just in terms of improving the learning of the children, but also in terms of social cohesion, because the teachers in both schools so much enjoyed learning from one another. I would defend it as a strategy for breaking down barriers in terms of social cohesion. We had schools from very rich parts of the town, of the city region, working with schools in the very poorest areas. And we saw them using their energy and their expectations to improve achievement. Our conclusion was the most powerful strategy for helping these keys to success schools were these partnerships. Of course, sometimes they did not work. We had created a kind of dating agency where we're trying to arrange partnerships, and sometimes they didn't work. Sometimes the schools didn't get on, particularly the school directors in that respect, and we had to pull it away right away. The evidence we have is that that's what made the big difference in the keys to success schools. So that's a fantastic finding. But there was an even more fantastic finding that we didn't spot for a while. And that was the learning was mutual. As we monitored the impact, we saw improvements not just in the keys to success schools, but also in the stronger schools. The process of partnering another school enabled the very strong schools to also improve, which suggests that we're onto something. We're onto a strategy that can have an impact across the system. On the right-hand side, we had what we call our Families of Schools initiative. Every school in Greater Manchester, 1,150, were placed in families based on a data system which meant that the schools in a family all served similar communities in terms of the socio-economic background of the families. Again, cutting across the boundaries of the local authorities. Usually the family would consist of 12, 15, or sometimes 20 or so schools. We had 58 primary families, and we had 11 secondary families, and the special schools were placed in the families as well. Just to give you a flavour, but this won't work now, I don't know why. I've lost it. Oh dear. Does it work on the machine? Oh yeah, thank you. The data system works like this. If you're interested in this in more detail, you can find it on the website of the Department for Education in England. Schools in a family, and this is family 53 in the primary sector, are placed on this matrix where on the vertical axis we map the progress the schools have made in the last 3 years in terms of the tests that the children take at 11. Across the horizontal matrix is the relative performance of the schools to one another within the family, and the vertical line is the average attainment for the schools within that particular family. Here we're getting into the idea of using evidence to challenge. Remember, these are all schools that seem to serve similar populations. Every school has a number, but in the material we can work out which the schools are. It's not hidden. So immediately we have to ask the question, why is it that schools 753 and schools 746 are doing so well compared with school 751, given that they all serve similar communities? Why are those two schools doing so well? Why is the other school doing so poorly? So the family of schools are invited to ask those questions. But the system is more sophisticated than that. It digs down, and it enables the schools to compare girls and boys, children from minority groups, children with special educational needs, children in public care. We can look at performance in different subjects of the curriculum. And when we do that, of course, we may find that school 751 has a strength within the family that can be used to move all the schools forward. So this Families of Schools material was an invitation of schools to learn from one another, and in so doing, to actually use the strengths within the family. Can we go back to the previous slide now, in that sense, really? Now, That, I have to say, in the 3 years, had varied impact. Some of the families were very successful and did wonderfully creative things. Others were much less successful. Some did nothing at all, I have to say. And maybe 3 years wasn't enough. But I think the idea is a neat one, and I think it's an interesting one that could be developed. And the system of data, I think, is very powerful. At the top of the diagram is what we called our leadership strategy. This was our attempt to create a structure in the system that might be sustainable. Because a big question in a large-scale project like this is you can get things done while you've got the money, but what happens when the money is taken away? So we wanted to invest in sustainability right from the beginning. And the way we tried to do this was to find the best school directors and encourage them to take on roles beyond their own schools. The phrase that we've used in the United Kingdom to describe this approach is asking senior people in schools to become systems leaders, as well as being leaders of their own school, to take on a wider role within the system. Over the period, we ended up with about 170 school directors who were formally designated as system leaders, all of them outstanding in their own school. And they were encouraged to coordinate the work with the Keys to Success schools and the work with the families of schools. And that was our investment for the future. As they grew, as a team of 170, again, the collaboration stimulated more innovation, more attempts to move knowledge around. We saw the creation of what we called hub schools, a hub like at the middle of a wheel. So we developed hub schools for teaching maths or teaching reading. We had hub schools for teaching children for whom English was a second language. We had hub schools that were particularly strong in teaching children with disabilities. And so we found the strengths, and those strengths were used to create professional development and support for other schools. Some of those schools became what were designated as teaching schools. The teaching schools. The concept of teaching school is analogous to the idea of a teaching hospital. Just as we have teaching hospitals, hospitals which do the work of a hospital, but also do research and do training because they are centres of excellence. Similarly, we developed teaching schools, something which is now part of national policy within my country. At the bottom of the diagram, we've developed what we called a series of work strands. These were attempts to encourage collaboration around big themes that needed to be addressed in Greater Manchester. So we had a work strand on the involvement of parents. We had a work strand on the work of governors. They are the people who manage the schools at the local level. And most importantly, we had a work strand on raising aspirations, particularly amongst children from disadvantaged background. What that led to was something which I think is absolutely crucial to the success of this kind of a project. It led to the efforts to link schools with the wider community in the way that I described earlier. And when we looked at Greater Manchester as an entity, we saw that there were fantastic community resources. We had a wonderful orchestra, internationally known, the Halley Orchestra, already working in some schools, but wanting to do more. We had two of the biggest football clubs in the world, Manchester City and Manchester United, already working in schools, but wanting to do more. We had 4 universities, including my own, already working in some of the disadvantaged schools to encourage the raising of aspirations, but wanting to do more. We found lots of the big companies, Marks and Spencer's, the Cooperative, Siemens, the science and technology company, that wanted to be involved. We found the radio stations and the television stations. The more we looked, the more we found. And what we tried to do was to encourage those organisations to be even more active in the school system around the theme of raising aspirations. The concept that I'm beginning to put together for you here, colleagues, is that of a self-improving system. A system that does not rely on people or organisations outside, but uses what's already there, a self-improving system. At the centre of the diagram is then the real challenge within this Greater Manchester Challenge. What about those 10 local authorities? In a sense, having shown already that they have not done a good job, what do we need them for? We've now got a self-improving system. Do we need local administration? Do we need local coordination? A very serious debate in the English context. I came to the view that we did need local coordination, but we needed local coordination of a different kind. Not the kind which tries to control things or manage things, more the kind of coordination which facilitates and encourages this expertise moving around within the system. We found that very difficult. It's a big challenge, and that still is work that is ongoing, even though the formal process of this project has continued. I need to jump 2 slides now. Of course, the ministers were interested in results, and I could bore you all night with statistics, but I'll just show you this one because it gives a flavour. This is the graph of the progress of children at the age of 16 when they take the examination that all young people in England take, the General Certificate of Secondary Education. What the graph shows you is that in 2007, overall, Manchester was well below the national average. That's why we were there. By 2010, Manchester had shot ahead of the national average, and those schools that we designated the Keys to Success schools, they'd gone even further above the national average in that respect, really. The results for 2011, which will be published in January, already show a further continuation of that trend. So clearly, from the point of view of government, here is something that is beginning to make progress. Next slide. There was a frustration in all of this for me because, of course, I'm a researcher. And the task of researchers is to make sense of things and to show relationships between factors. But I was not employed to be a researcher in this project. I was employed to be the champion, to lead the thing, to bring people together in various ways. And so I'm frustrated because I'd like to have more detailed analysis, which I didn't have the time to do. But in general, I come to 2 conclusions which I think are worthy of consideration in other places. It seems to me that what we have demonstrated is to move a system forward in terms of both excellence and equity. You need more collaboration within schools and between schools. But the extra dimension to that, which I think we still need to do a lot more, is that effort of encouraging collaboration within the school system has to reach out to the wider community. It has to involve universities. It has to involve businesses. It has to involve religious organisations and community organisations and families, of course, in that respect, really. Can we go to the next slide? Thanks. Sorry to me. There's a bit of theory you can throw in here. We ought to have a bit of theory because this is a university. And the theory is that of social capital, the notion of social capital. Just as you can have financial capital or physical capital, you can have social capital, the capacity of a system or an organisation to learn from itself. And what we know is that very successful organisations are strong in social capital. We also know that very successful communities and successful families are strong in social capital. They have trust. They have an awareness that people are interdependent. What we've explored through this project is how you can strengthen social capital within schools, between schools, and between schools and their local communities. And that's the generalization that I would make, that I'm sure would be relevant anywhere in the world, really. It's a complex story, and there's more detail you can imagine than I have time to tell you. And I don't want to underestimate the complexity and the problems. But in another sense, what I've described for you this evening is something which is actually, in one particular sense, simple. To move an education system forward, to make it both excellent and equitable, inclusive and fair, you need the collective will of people to make it happen. Next slide. That's what makes the difference, the collective will to make it happen. And that's the message I would like to leave you with. I would welcome your questions and your comments. Thank you very much.
Muy bien, pues vamos a iniciar un turno de preguntas.
I will make the question in English. My question is, you told us that we need resources. Of course, when we look into the present system, we face Europe and America and all the countries face financial crisis. Can you hear me?
I can't
financial
find you.
Crisis.
Where are you? Oh yeah. Hi.
And at present, how will these schools and higher education systems will develop their own resources and local resources and these networks if we don't have this kind of financial resources backed by the governments? Because all the governments are cutting down the budget for higher education, secondary schooling, all the systems.
It's a good question, and another question that is associated with that, which could be asked, is you've just spent £50 million of public money. We ought to see improvements, otherwise you've wasted the money. But the only thing I would say to you is that prior to the period of this project, much, much more money had been spent, and it had not made any difference. So what I think we tried to do with the £50 million was to use it strategically and to spend it on things which could possibly become sustainable. But inevitably, some of the things didn't work. And in one sense, we wasted money. But in another sense, we didn't, because we learnt from our mistakes. And often some of the best lessons in life are from our mistakes, really. So the additional money gave us leverage, gave us the potential to incentivize and make things happen in that respect. But going to the core of your question, and inevitably it's something we're thinking about in the new economic climate, is if we're going to see the reduction of resources, financial resources in the system, will that take away capacity? And common sense would say it would, and I would have to say that. But I've spent a lot of my life, in addition to working in England, working in other countries, particularly in some of the poorest countries of the world, in sub-Saharan Africa, in parts of Latin America, and in parts of Asia. And I end up where I finished in my presentation, the will to make it happen. I've seen remarkable things in rural districts in Africa, in very poor favelas in São Paulo, Brazil, in poor shanty towns in Mumbai, in India, where people, parents, teachers, volunteers, are so committed to education that they just make things happen. And so when that kind of question is asked in my own country, as it often is, what I say to my friends there is, look, don't forget you are in one of the richest countries of the world. Okay, we're in a financial climate, but we are still relatively wealthy. The buildings we have, the resources we have, the human resources we have are beyond the imagination of the great majority of the poor countries of the world in that respect. So I end up with two arguments, really. As citizens, we should continue to argue for better and more resources for our school system. But the second argument is, as professionals, we must make use of the resources we've got. That is our moral duty. And the central message that I hope you've taken from my presentation, both in the early part and then through my analysis of this large-scale project, is much of it has been about making better use of what is there. That, I suggest, is our moral duty in that respect.
Good evening. My question is, how did you manage the bond and the jump to the secondary educational system to the higher educational system for the people with disabilities that they don't have the right to reach the disability students allowance, and because of the diversity is very, very, well, it's enormous. So
yeah.
How did you manage this jump?
Well, the first thing to say, in being very honest, is that remains a challenge in my country. We don't have simple, easy answers to that very challenging question, really. But I know there are a number of people in the room whose main focus of work is in relation to disability. I've not lost that in my discussion. I'm concerned with all vulnerable children and young people, and that includes sometimes disabled people, but there are some disabled people in my country who are not particularly vulnerable. They do very, very well, but there are others that don't. I want not to look at particular groups. I want to look at the reason that some people are marginalised, and the reasons why some people are excluded and what we can do about it in that respect. So we worked with our 4 universities in Greater Manchester, and one of the things we got them to do was to build on a project that was already going on in one of the primary schools in the city of Manchester, where they were working with 10 and 11-year-old children to take children on visits to places where they might find a job later on. Remember, these are 10 and 11-year-olds. So the children were taken to the university, they were taken to a hospital, they were taken to the BBC, they were taken to a posh hotel. And the visits were opportunities for them to find out what kind of jobs are there and what do you need to do to get those jobs. The children then developed some fantastic materials, and they subsequently invited their parents into the school, and the children talked to their parents about the kind of jobs that they might want when they leave school. Now, this was going on in one school. Over the last 3 years, we've extended that to 200 schools, all in the most disadvantaged communities, and it's been orchestrated by the 4 universities working collectively. Now, what we're asking the university to do is to reach out to children and young people who don't normally have opportunities. You remember I talked about pathways. Well, in the photograph I showed you, the children on the left-hand side, those boys, all the pathways of the world are open to them because their parents make sure that happen. The boys on the right-hand side, they don't even know there are pathways in many cases because their parents don't know. So the most vulnerable people in our society, the poor, the disadvantaged, sometimes young people from immigrant families, not always, some disabled people, the doors are closed to them. And what we're talking about is working with the system to reform the system in order to make it more equitable. Now, I think in relation to the particular issue of disability, I think there is a very important role for the disabled organisations, parents and young people themselves, to be part of that challenge to the system, to make sure that their voice is heard in all of that respect. These are big challenges. We're breaking down barriers and prejudices that have been there for generations. And it will take us time, but I believe we are making progress in that respect. So to answer the question very simply, we certainly not found a quick answer, because I don't think there is a quick answer, but I think we've seen how collaborating with universities, with companies as well, with businesses and companies, can lead to some innovations in these very challenging areas.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for an excellent presentation and for bringing today to this room all these really high quality thoughts that share most of our worries today and implements new insights to our daily work. So thank you for that. I have barely like one concrete question in all this. But I think it's due to my own background. I'm very concerned about quality and equation in between the needs of poor people and few resources people, but also in general in the normal distribution of population there is a branch of people and students that might have special needs or special requirements just because they are above the mean. Usually, and their performance, sometimes they have the potential to be performing in a very high standard and quality within the educational system. So my question would be, which thoughts, according to your experience, you have in according to have a really good balance between those two, like attending to the needs of those two extremes of the educational system? Thank you.
Yes. I mean, it's, again, a very challenging question, and it would be easy for me to give a glib answer, and I don't want to do that. It's a complicated question, and it would require a lot of thought. But the category special educational needs in my country has grown. The term has been used for more and more children. And to be honest, the vast majority of children who come to be categorized as having special educational needs in my country are simply children that the system is letting down. So it creates a sort of tautology, you know. Children don't do well, so in a sense we almost blame them by saying they have special educational needs in that respect. So what I'm proposing really is, in one sense, quite radical. I am talking about the reorganization of the system and schools within it that at the moment caters for many children, the reorganization of it such that it caters for as far as possible, all children. And when I say all, I mean all. And that's why the inspiration of countries like Canada and Finland and Korea should be that, an inspiration. We know that in our country we could do an awful lot better. My guess is, similarly here in Spain, you could do a lot better in terms of the children that we're not reaching in that respect. I think in the project I've described, there were inbuilt limitations to do with national policy that would need to be challenged. In one sense, it was quite a conservative policy because the politicians I worked with, and I worked with very good people, ministers and civil servants, they wanted to see improvement in test scores. That's what they were concerned with. But the reality is, the tests are part of the problem, not part of the solution. The tests are so narrow that they test the wrong thing. And what we know in education is what gets measured gets done. If you decide you're going to measure something, that becomes the priority. So if we really want to shift these education systems, sooner or later, we have to rethink the curriculum. And we need more flexibility in the curriculum, and we need a broader curriculum. And in order to rethink the curriculum, we have to rethink the forms of assessment we use to signal progress. And in England, certainly, that would also mean we would have to rethink the national framework for inspecting schools, which is also rather narrow in that respect. So let's be in no doubt, the proposals I'm making, if we follow them through logically, are extremely radical of in relation to the status quo. And so somebody like me, I'm afraid, becomes pragmatic. And I could be criticized for this, because I try to push the system along to the extent that I think is possible. And in doing that, I collude with people and I compromise in order to make things happen. But I could quite obviously be criticized for not really saying what I really believe, that to really make a system excellent and equitable, we would need to change the curriculum, we would need to change the assessment system, we would have to change the inspection system, but even more, we would have to change society. We would have to address the sorts of things that the people who have been protesting on your streets over the last 3 or 4 months have been protesting about. The problems we're talking about are not problems of schools, they're problems of a deeply unfair society. So we're into some very challenging issues when we talk about the most vulnerable children in our schools.
¿Más preguntas?
It's okay to ask in Spanish.
Well, I do have one question. If nobody else. Which is your perspective, your feeling, your opinion in relation to the new trend among politicians and policymakers to, I mean, it seems to me that now the politicians are focusing more on the priority of competence, on competence capacity of Europe, of the countries, you know, new skills for new jobs, yes, entrepreneurship, innovation, and so on.
Yes.
I mean, which is the level of I mean, I understand it's compatible with your proposals, but which is your, can you share with us a little bit your reflection or your feelings? Or?
Yes. Well, I mean, the whole European project, in crisis that it is, seems to me to have so many positive features in relation to what we've talked about. I'm talking about moving knowledge around within a system, in this case, Greater Manchester, or possibly in England, but the potential to learn from other countries and their experiences is just phenomenal, really. And of course, many of the biggest challenges we're facing in the education system in relation to diversity are being brought about through migration. You know, some of the biggest challenges in the English system are because we have children arriving from other countries who don't speak English, who are arriving at various stages of the system. And the system has to learn with this ongoing, how to live with this ongoing mobility in that respect. So it does seem to me that the potential of the European project, the international project, if you will, is very consistent with what I'm talking about in that respect. And so I would very much want to be part of that and try to be part of that in that respect.
Si no hay más preguntas, lo dejamos aquí.
Is there a check back?
Yeah. One final one.
Okay.
Pulse por atrás.
Buenas tardes, soy un estudiante internacional, soy de Chile y también me gustaría poder consultar tu opinión respecto a algo que considero fundamental en tu exposición, que es la figura de la escuela pública. En Chile la escuela pública ha tendido a desaparecer durante los últimos años. La cobertura que tiene la escuela pública bordea el 35%. Y es un país en Latinoamérica donde se presenta un gran tipo de segregación social, donde el más rico es mucho más rico que el más pobre. Entonces, ¿crees tú que un desafío así es posible sin la existencia de la escuela pública, como a nosotros nos plantean en Chile?
Again, a very important question, really. I drew attention to the boys in my photograph who are in private schools. In fact, in the United Kingdom, only 7% of young people go to private schools. Much smaller than certainly in parts of Spain. I know that in Madrid and Barcelona, a high number of children go to private schools. And of course, in places like Chile, the World Bank in particular have been encouraging more privatization within the education system. I mean, it's where I come again to this kind of constant dilemma I have. Do I become pragmatic and try to do something that's conceivable within the existing circumstances? Or do I take a radical position such that I probably will not even be listened to, really? Because if you ask me to take my radical position, I would say we would be better if all children went to the same system in the same local schools and people work together. And of course, that's the feature of the Scandinavian countries. There's very little private education in Scandinavia. All the kids go to the same local school, the school for all. But clearly this some would say this neoliberal project of encouraging privatization and independence and competition is very much the flavour of the moment. And in my country, it's there in every one of our major political parties in that respect, really. So when I take my pragmatic position, what I'm trying to do through a project like this is to try to minimise the dangers of that by creating these horizontal pathways between the privileged and the less privileged. Now, whether that's sustainable, and certainly in an extreme case like Chile, is really a very serious question in that respect. The only thing I would add to that is, I am a great believer that schools should be given space to be autonomous and independent. The kind of emphasis I've placed on creativity and innovation needs schools to have space. Not more centralised policies, not more dictation from government about what you're trying to do. So my vision would be one of schools having a lot of autonomy, but within a system where the glue comes from a set of agreed values. And that's where I think government have a very important role to play. The role of government surely should be to find those values and to make sure that everybody is accountable for them. And clearly the values that I would be wanting to encourage would be around social justice, inclusion and equity. And it seems to me that I think those are there in those Scandinavian countries and in Canada. I don't know South Korea so well. And I think that's what I would like to encourage in my own country, certainly in that respect.
Bueno, pues si os parece lo dejamos ahí. Agradecemos al profesor. Gracias a todos y todas y seguimos mañana con otra jornada.